In a world where anything is possible, in a world where the normal and the paranormal reside, Almost Unbelievable brings to you the stories you want to hear, but fear to hear. Join us in the pit.
You have joined the Almost Unbelievable Paranormal Podcast with Katz and Ranty. I'm Katz. Are you there, Ranty?
I most certainly am. How are you doing today, Katz?
I'm doing really well today, and I do believe we are in for a longer show than usual, are we?
Perhaps longer, maybe more interesting. Certainly something we've not done before. We're going to have a double whammy today, and they're not as scary as last week's, for sure, but they're definitely interesting, and I hope that you're going to enjoy these.
Well, at the risk of overdoing it with the stories, I do have, as usual, a little story of my own. Do you want to hear it?
Oh, a little story of your own. Absolutely. Go ahead, Katz.
So, have you seen the infamous made-for-TV only movie called The Ghost of Flight 401?
No, I haven't.
Well, in that movie, there is a character called Jessica who enters a plane called the L-1011 plane. It's a tri-star plane. I don't know a great deal about planes, but it's a plane, and she's a crew member. She gets on the plane, and she's cleaning the aircraft to make sure that it's ready for the next flight. And she enters the lower gallery of the aircraft and notices it's extremely cold, to the point where, you know, she feels like she's almost in a freezer. She couldn't figure out what was going on. She knew something really strange was happening. Anyway, as she's cleaning down there, she glances into one of the ovens, and there's a reflection in the oven of a gentleman stood behind her wearing a captain's uniform. And when she turns around, the captain isn't there. And this really shook her up. She was absolutely adamant that's what she'd seen. And she sort of ran out the plane and needed some consoling for a bit. Now, that's the story. The film itself is based on a supposed true story about a flight called Flight 401. And apparently Flight 401 crashed in 1972 and it killed 101 of 176 people on board. But as it turns out, parts of that aircraft were actually salvaged and put in other aircraft. And when Jessica had gone and told the story about the captain she'd seen, it was brought to her attention that she wasn't the first person to have seen this so-called ghost or apparition. There'd been lots and lots of people, and the plane she was working on had had one of the parts from Flight 401 fitted into it. And more so, when she contacted other people who worked on planes that had other of those parts of Flight 401 put in, they were experiencing similar events. How about that?
Well, the first thing that springs to mind is cheapskates. Absolute cheapskates. I mean, they're a plane that kills more than half its passengers as it crashes, and all they can think about is salvaging parts to stick in other planes. That sounds terrible.
I know, but we've heard that stuff before. Do you remember from season 1 we had James Dean and his little bastard car? And parts of that were taken and put in other cars, and those cars had horrendous accidents. It seems to be a common theme.
It does, and I don't think people are just getting it right now, but clearly it would suggest that you just don't put parts that have been in an accident in another vehicle, because it's going to have some kind of effect, and in this case it's clearly having other effects too. It's preposterous. Why would they do that? They make enough money, surely they could put their own parts. Right, that's just me moaning about the cost of the airlines, but seriously, I mean, wow, crazy story. But like you said, James Dean's car, and there was another car as well that you mentioned towards the back end, and I can't remember what that was called.
I think it was Franz Ferdinand's car. Similar story.
Quite possibly, yes, World War One, that was it. And yeah, it just seems ridiculous that they would do that. But hey, listen, ghosts seem to, well, in my opinion anyway, or spirits, seem to be connected to some of the last things that they were in contact with, I think. And it seems that this wouldn't be out of the normal for that. So I'm not surprised that people are seeing things. And I guess this is going to fall into some kind of story today. I imagine that's why you've given me this intro, correct?
Yeah, well, I do believe, funnily enough, as a coincidence, that the first of today's stories is about a plane that may or may not itself have been a ghost. Do you want to tell us more about it?
Ooh, Right, okay. Well, I'm not going to tell you much more about it myself, but I will let Matt talk about it. And Matt was there on this day many, many years ago now, but he's come onto the show to tell his story, and he wants to get it off his chest because it's been bugging him for a very long time. So, without further ado, we are going to introduce you to Matt. Matt, are you there?
All right, here goes. I'm somebody that's always been interested in the paranormal, but my view has always been that I would like to believe things are true, but until I experience it myself, that's the way I look at it. It'd be cool if it was true, but I'm not going to believe it till it happens to me. So this is the first paranormal experience I ever had. And at the time, I didn't realize it somehow and kind of seemed to forget it for a lot of years. So it was December of 2001, the winter. It was the second to last weekend of deer season. And I was going in the woods with my father to hunt. And we had just gotten about a foot or 18 inches of really wet, heavy snow. And it was kind of one of those storms where the snow stuck to all the trees and everything was bent over. So you're in places where you normally could see like 200 yards, you could see about 50. It just obscured everything. It dampened the sound, and the woods were just felt kind of different if anybody's been in the woods like that. So this was the first year. I think I would have been 11 at the time. And I'd been going in the woods hunting with my father since I was about 5 or 6. So this year he wanted to see if I would, start sitting on my own, and then we could split up and hunt 2 different areas sort of thing. So today was the first day that I was going to sit by myself. And it was a spot that I'd been to a million times before. I knew exactly how to get there. No issues with that. So we'd hiked in to a certain point, and then he went one way, I went the other. So took my time, got into the spot. Took a while just because of how much snow there was. And I don't know, I got there, got my stuff unpacked, just kind of set up, hanging out. I mean, that's what you do in a deer stand is you sit there and hang out, hope something comes by. So I think about an hour went by. I can't remember exactly how long it took, but I just knew something felt weird about the woods, but I thought it was just me and the fact I was on my own for the first time, and there was all the snow. Everything looked different, kind of strange. And this was 2001, obviously was the year 9/11 happened. And as an 11-year-old kid, that had scared the hell out of me. I just remember watching it on the news and knowing that there was people dying in horrific ways. And all I could do was sit there and watch. And it terrified me to think that could happen. So the only explanation I can think of is some sort of fear-induced hallucination that came out of nowhere, because at the time I was thinking about hunting, being in the woods, trying to, be tough so I didn't get scared and make my father think I was a wimp. So it doesn't make sense to me that this would come out of nowhere the way it did. So anyways, I'm sitting in my spot. It's been maybe an hour or so. Haven't seen anything, haven't heard anything. The woods are totally dead silent because it was right after the storm finished, so the creatures hadn't really come back out yet. There was no wind, no birds, no nothing, just quiet. And I started to hear an airplane flying over, and it sounded totally strange and different, but it happens fairly often where I hunt. You can hear a plane fly over, and it's, a minute or two and it's gone. But I could just hear the sound droning on and getting louder and louder. And it seemed like it took 5 or 10 minutes. I was sitting in the woods listening to this plane fly over until it was so loud it was like deafening. It was all I could hear. And finally, just waiting and waiting, I was getting more nervous because, like I said, after 9/11 happened, it was kind of every time I'd hear a plane fly over, I was a little bit nervous, like, oh shit, is something going to happen here? And I don't know, at some point I finally got past that, but this was 2 months after it happened. So that was the first thing that came to mind, like something is weird about this, and hopefully it's not some weird terrorist attack on the woods of Vermont. But as an 11-year-old kid, you don't quite think about that stuff as much. So finally, after 5 or 10 minutes of listening to this thing flying over, I finally get a view of it, and it was just a normal, like, passenger jet, normal sized airplane you'd fly across the country on. And for some reason, it was flying like right at treetop levels, flying over, and it was so loud, it was completely deafening. And I watched it fly over and go out of sight for me, which was behind some trees. But I knew the direction it was heading was directly straight across the road into the face of a mountain that's also part of our property. But the mountain's, I don't know, maybe 1,000, 1,500 feet tall. And the plane was maybe 100 feet off the ground. And the direction it was going was exactly smack dab for the face of the mountain. So all I could think at the time was something just happened. This plane is flying into the mountain, whether it's on purpose or not, I don't know, but I don't understand what's happening. Why is this in the middle of the woods? Why is there this airplane flying into the mountains? So of course I get out my radio and try to talk to my father. And when I turned the radio on, I tried to call him, couldn't get anything back. And then all of a sudden it started sounding like somebody was just clicking the mic on the other side over and over. And apparently I didn't find this out till after the fact, but my father said that this radio was broken and that he had that happen to him before. So I think that was just bad luck at the time that added another layer of fear, because I was already, after seeing this plane go over and thinking it's going to crash into the mountain and there's some terrorist attack happening, I was already fairly terrified. So I sat in my deer stand, and I remember realizing that the plane had flown over, had gone out of view, and I was waiting for the boom because I knew it was going to crash and explode, and it would be a very loud noise. And it seems like as soon as it went out of view, the sound had just faded. And like I said, it was the longest, slowest engine sound of a plane flying over. It was the loudest thing. It was all you could hear in the woods. And it just, once it was out of view, it was like it disappeared. It was never there. So at some point, I don't remember how long it took me. I think it was only a couple minutes, but after that, I decided I have to get out of the woods. I have to go see what had happened and see if I can help anybody or, do anything. Probably nobody survived, but I need to go see what happened. And I was extremely terrified at this point. And I know, me telling the story now, and for other people listening, I can understand it doesn't sound scary. Like a plane flew over you, big deal. But for some reason, at the time, the age I was, this was as scared as I'd ever been. So I got all my gear together, threw my gun over my back, started hiking out of the woods. And I probably made it out in half the time it took me to walk in. But as I was hiking out, that's kind of a windabout way to get out. There's go down a hill, cross the river, the whole thing. And it's about 3/4 of the way out, I could finally get a view of the mountain across the road that I thought this plane had flown into. So I'm hiking out and didn't realize I'd lost a couple things. So I was in such a hurry to get out. My heart was racing the whole time. And I finally came out to this clearing where I could see the mountain. And I had figured the whole time, I'm like, there's going to be, fire and smoke, and a plane just crashed into the mountain. It's going to be horrible. And I came out of the forest and looked across the road at the mountain, and it was just, same old mountain I always look at. It was nothing different. Nothing had changed. So I tried to understand, like, as soon as I saw that, I'm like, something is truly wrong here. Like, that scared me even more, to think that I'd just seen this thing happen, but there's no evidence that anything had happened at all. And also, the way the plane was flying, it would have flown directly over my grandmother's house, almost dead center over the top of it. So I continue going, get all the way out, walk into my grandmother's house, and I think we had gotten there at about noon or so. So we were going to be in the woods till dark. So this is like, I don't know, maybe 2:00 that I'm walking out of the woods. And I remember standing in the doorway, and she came up and like, what's happening? And I was so terrified I just broke down in tears. And I just remember bawling my eyes out because I couldn't understand what had just happened to me. None of it made sense. I'd heard the noise, I'd seen the plane fly over on a direct course. Like the last spot I had seen it, there's no way it could have turned away or done anything. It would have crashed and a lot of people would have died. So I finally got myself together and started asking her, like, did you see what happened to the plane? Where'd the plane go? And she's like, what are you talking about? I didn't see a plane. And I'm like, yeah, it was right at the treetops. It was going to fly into the mountain. It was like a terrorist attack again. And yeah, she had no clue what I was talking about. So since I hadn't talked to my father this whole time, I pulled my radio out that had been broken and not working while this whole situation was happening. And magically I turn it on and it works totally fine. I call my father, who also, I forgot to mention, the spot he had gone to sit at was maybe a quarter of a mile uphill from me, which was in a direct line from where this plane flew. It would have flown directly over him and then over me and then across the road into the mountain. And I called him and he's like, what are you doing back at the house? Well, I saw that plane that was going to crash and, it scared me. I wanted to make sure, if we could help or something. And he was the same way. Like, what do you mean there's a plane? I didn't see any plane. I'm like, I just remember feeling like I was like, you're sitting in a room and everyone's staring at you because you're the weird person, because I had this experience that was so terrifying and nobody else that was there witnessed anything. And at some point he came out of the woods early, and I'm not positive. I believe that was the first weekend of our muzzleloader season, which is the last deer season of the year. Yeah, it starts on a Saturday, ends the next Sunday. So I believe that was the first weekend. And I'm pretty sure I went hunting again after that year. But I told my father, like, I'm going to sit with you. I'm not going to hunt by myself until next year. Let's just finish this year after what happened. And I don't know if he ever actually believed me or not. I don't know why he wouldn't, but the whole story was so damn weird. I can understand why he wouldn't, or why he'd think it was weird. So the strange thing is, I tried to remember, like looking back, I remember how terrified I was, but I don't remember, like, I'm surprised I would have gone into the woods again after that immediately the next weekend. But I'm fairly certain I went back next weekend, sat with my father. That was the end of deer season for the year. By the next year, I'd forgotten anything had happened. But like I said in the beginning, I have been interested in the paranormal for most of my life, since I don't remember what age I learned that ghosts were a thing or whatever. The paranormal was something people were into. But it was like after this experience happened, I don't know if I totally blocked it from my memory and just did not want to admit that it happened, that it existed, because I was 11 at the time. I'm 31 now. And for 18 years in the middle, I had no recollection of this happening, never thought about it, never considered it. Didn't happen as far as I was concerned. I didn't know it was a thing. And about 3 years ago, I started getting into David Paulides and Missing 411 and all that. And even though I've never heard a story quite like what I experienced, I still have never heard of something like that. Some of the stories I read were about strange things happening in the woods, where a little piece or part here and there would be close. And at some point it jogged my memory, and it, like, all of a sudden that memory snapped full right into the front of my mind that, hey, this happened to me. And I don't understand, after all those years of watching paranormal shows and listening to podcasts and reading books, why it was just gone from my memory that whole time. And now it's snapped right back, and I can remember almost the whole situation, and in very fine detail. Yeah, and that's what bothers me the most, is that it's such a strange experience that I can't make sense of. And why it was just totally gone from my mind for like 18 years and I never thought about it. And I guess that's it.
Okay, well, I have a million questions.
I told you it's a weird one.
Yeah, I have a million questions, I tell you. What about you, Katz? Have you got a million questions?
I have. I'll let you go first. Although, can I just ask one question first and I'll pass it over to you?
Sure.
The plane that you were talking about, you said it was flying quite low, you could see it clearly. Were there any sort of markings on the plane that you could then maybe later use to identify the airline it come from, or anything like that?
Oh man, the way it was flying over, it was kind of like if I was standing straight up looking at the path it was flying, it would have been like at the 2 o'clock position. So I was mainly looking up at the underside, but I'm pretty sure it had like a red stripe down the side of it. But it was, I mean, I don't know planes that well. I guess it was like a 747 or whatever, just a standard passenger jet. But that's pretty much what I remember. Is it was white, and I'm fairly certain it had a red stripe down the side.
Because the reason I ask is if it could, the airline could be identified, for example, from the way it looked, then that gives a leeway into contacting airlines and giving the time and the date and asking were there any planes flying over at that time, for example.
That makes sense. I never really thought about that. I guess I could look, because in Vermont, I mean, we have like 2 airports in the whole state. Yeah, I never thought about that. I guess I could find a way to go back and see what airline flies over a property, and what could have happened if it was an actual thing and not something I hallucinated, or I don't know.
Yeah, I just thought I'd ask that before I forgot to ask a question. But Rancy, I'll put myself on mute and I'll hand over to you, mate.
Perfect. Right, so yeah, I have a million questions, like I said. So, when you went into the woods, was 9/11 on your mind at any point on your way from setting off to get into your destination?
I'm glad you asked that, because that was another part I meant to mention, is that, well, 9/11 had totally scared the hell out of me as a kid. By this point, it was 2 months after the fact. Still, once in a while, if I heard a plane fly over, I guess it was kind of like a PTSD thing, that it would bring that fear back and I'd be wondering. But I was walking into the woods for a day of hunting with my father. I mean, I was thinking about hoping a buck would come by and hoping I'd make my dad proud and not do exactly what I did and freak out, I was hoping I'd go out there and sit till dark or shoot a deer on my own and kind of make my old man proud. But yeah, I can honestly say that it was the furthest thing from my mind was thinking about that and what had happened.
Okay. So you also said that you heard the noise from about between 5 and 10 minutes. Okay. So if we assume about 5 minutes, I'm just going to go to about 5 minutes. I'm not going to say 10. And you say as soon as you saw the plane, it went past you. How long would you say you still heard the plane for after it went past you or out of sight?
Maybe 5 or 10 seconds. Like, it was the whole time coming in, it was the long droning, louder and louder and louder of an airplane engine. And then as soon as it went over and out of sight, it was like shut off. Like, there was no sound. It all just faded to silence. And that was another thing that it didn't make sense, because I was waiting for a boom. Like, I knew it was going to fly into this mountain and explode. And then all that loud sound that it just built and built for, minutes was all of a sudden just shut off. Like you flipped a switch almost, or more like you turned down the volume knob, because it just faded away to nothing.
Okay. And would you also say that as a child, you were able to identify different planes? In other words, could it have been a sort of like a Cessna or something like that? Or are you absolutely sure that it was a 747 or a 737, something like that?
I'm absolutely positive. It was, I'm trying to think the best way to explain it. I mean, I could tell it had the long cylindrical body with really wide wings, not, like a little tiny 2-seater Cessna. Because it also, when it flew over, it was so low that I could, really tell how big it was just by how much space in the sky it took up.
Wow. Okay. So by all accounts, you're saying that you saw a
commercial airline plane flying just a 100 or 200 feet above the treetops in a mountainous area. And also, I would say that because your father and your grandmother didn't actually see or hear the plane, this was definitely a personal experience for you.
Yes. Yeah, it was. That was the weirdest part, is I knew both of them were more than close enough. Like I said, the direction it flew would have been almost a straight line from my father to me over my grandmother's house across the road. But yeah, somehow neither of them heard anything or saw anything. And there was another part I forgot to mention, is that the spot where this happened is actually a spot where, like 5 years later, I think I was 16, I built a tree house there. Once I built that, I would go and spend like a week living in the woods in a tree house in that spot. And I'd had like a couple kind of weird things happen, but nothing at all like that.
Okay, so my next question is going to be, do you know of any planes that may have crashed in the area either before or since?
There was one probably 5 years ago that was a Cessna. It was some guy out with his buddy touring around, and for some reason they had to put it down in a field that was maybe like a mile and a half from our farm. And that was kind of barely crashed. You know, they landed and then it hit a rock right before it stopped and just tipped up on the nose, but I don't think anybody got hurt.
Okay, so we all know that the classical 747 or 737, they have trouble finding top speed at very low altitudes. So I think they can only do 200, 250 miles an hour or so low down. But higher up, that's the higher up they go, they can find 600 miles an hour, no problem. So I'm going to assume that the plane that you saw flying over was not traveling at a supersonic speed, but would have been more in keeping with a plane coming into land or something like that, from what you've told me. Is that right?
Yeah, that sounds fair.
Okay. And my next question is, how far away were you from the base of the mountain, and what kind of incline would you give to the mountain itself? I mean, was it like is it a 1 in 10 slope? Is it a 1 in 20, 1 in 50? How long would it have taken for the plane, do you think, to have reached the bottom of that mountain?
So where I was sitting, probably maybe a little bit more than a mile from the base of the mountain. And I wish I could show you guys a picture. When you're standing at my grandmother's house looking across the road, there's about 300 yards of field, and then the woods start, and that's where the mountain starts going up. But it's one of those, when you're standing there looking at it, the face of it looks totally flat almost. It's that steep. So the higher you go up the mountain, the steeper it gets. So even at the base, it's probably like a 5-10, and then all the way up towards the top, it's like a 9. So it just keeps getting steeper and steeper. But from where I watched the plane fly over, I would imagine it would have been like 2 or 3 seconds before it impacted. It was going fast enough, and where I saw it go out of sight, I basically, from where I was sitting, where it went out of sight, it was, if I had one more opening, basically, I could have seen it go into the mountain.
Okay. So by my reckoning, if it was doing, let's say, 200 miles an hour, and it's about a mile to the base of the mountain, it's roughly around about 18 seconds or so. And we also know that the plane's maneuverability down at low levels, and I mean, you just wouldn't expect a commercial airline flying passengers to be going 100 feet above the trees. It just wouldn't happen. I mean, that's just an impossibility. So I know this line of questioning sounds a bit silly, but I have to go through it because the audience will want to know.
No, I totally understand. I mean, like I said, since whatever it was that jogged my memory made me start thinking about this, I've been going over it myself. Like, the only thing I keep coming back to is that I had some weird hallucination that just came on out of the blue for some unknown reason.
Yeah, so my final line of question is basically about that. Do you feel that you was under any additional stress at the time? Was there anything? I know that you've said that when you've seen planes flying over at that time, you were also acutely aware of 9/11, and that kind of played on you. Do you think that the noise of this, what you assumed was a plane that was at least 5 or 10 minutes, by your own words, coming towards you, and then you saw a plane, was the plane a hallucination, or were you hearing something and you just put a plane there? You know, is there something that's just triggered the visualization of a plane, or are you absolutely 100% sure you actually saw a plane?
In my mind, I'm 100% positive what I saw, but it's the other thing is, the sound had started, you know, like I said, it took so long with the sound getting louder and louder. I still wasn't nervous at that time. Like, I was sitting there, I remember thinking, like, I can't wait to ask my old man, what the heck is the deal with this plane? Like, he's a little ways up the hill from me. I know he's heard it. Like, how the heck does a plane take this long to fly over? And it kept getting louder and louder. And it wasn't till I actually saw it and watched it go out of sight, where it was aimed right at that mountain, that I actually became afraid and knew that something was wrong.
I get you. So the only time that you actually became frightened was when you saw how low this plane was, and you instinctively knew, even at the age of 11, that there was no way that that plane was going to not impact the mountain.
Exactly. Yeah, I remember as soon as I watched it go out of sight, I'm like, there's going to be dead people and an exploded plane, and like, I knew that there's no way that there's any other outcome from that. Just the way I saw it, the direction it was flying, the speed, and then like poof, it was gone.
Well, I've got to say, I mean, everything that you've said to me sounds like you actually believe what you saw, and you believe what you went through, and you believe everything that you're telling me right now. So I have no doubts that from what you've said, it's a completely genuine story, 100% genuine story. It's whether or not we can find an answer for it. Now, Katz, have you got any questions that you'd like to ask in the meantime before we wrap this one up?
I mean, there were some going through my head as we were talking. I think you've covered most of them. I'm really interested in getting some more detail about the markings on the plane. And if after the chat you remember anything, you know, just drop us an email and let us know, because I would love to be able to then go and start searching airlines, looking at what airlines have what markers, and try and make some headway that way, I think. But it's been a great story. Really, thank you so much.
No problem.
Right. Well, I have nothing else. Ranty, you?
No, I have nothing else either. I think it's been a cracking story, but we've got a lot of work to do to dig ourselves some kind of resolution to this. I know Katz is going to have his work cut out, and so am I, because we're trying something new this season. So let's see what we can come up with. But in the meantime, thank you for the story, and we'll speak to you soon.
No problem.
Well, thank you very much, Matt, for this story. Absolutely incredible. But before we get into the nitty-gritty about what we think about it, I do believe we have time for another story.
And I believe that we may even have time for another one of my little stories, if you're interested.
Oh, yeah, sure. Go ahead. Right. I am all ears. Fire away.
Okie dokie. I just wonder if this story has got anything to do with the next story we're going to hear. Who knows? Have you seen the film Shaun of the Dead?
I'd like to say yes, and I'm sure I have, but I couldn't be 100% sure, so I'm going to say possibly.
Well, in the film Shaun of the Dead, it's a zombie comedy. I was going to say it's a zombie comedy film with Simon Pegg, really funny, and they hide out in a pub called the Winchester from a horde of attacking zombies. Now, the pub is called the Winchester because it's named after something that hangs above the bar. What is going to be hanging above the bar with the famous name Winchester?
Well, I imagine it would be a shotgun.
Absolutely. So, shotgun or a rifle? I don't know my guns too well.
Rifle, but yeah, probably a rifle, actually. Yeah, Winchester rifle. Yes, my bad.
Well, I haven't got a clue, but they're all the same to me. I never even held one. But still, the Winchester rifle or shotgun or whatever it is obviously extremely famous. Obviously not that famous because I don't know what it is, but it's a famous gun, isn't it? A type of gun. I know it's not a water pistol, but that's not relevant to the story. What's relevant to the story is it was designed by somebody with the last name Winchester, who unfortunately died before his time, leaving his wife, Sarah Winchester, with a huge fortune. Now, Sarah Winchester was a great believer in the paranormal. She was into spiritualism and clairvoyancy. Not that she claimed to have those abilities herself, but she was often consulting mediums and clairvoyants. And when things started to go wrong after her husband died, she became of the belief that her family had been cursed and that she was being haunted by all the people who'd been killed by one of these Winchester rifles or shotguns or water pistols, whatever. And she got a little bit freaked by that and decided that she was going to leave where she was living, move miles and miles away, and build her own, what she was going to call the Winchester Mansion. So that's what she did. She moved hundreds of miles away. She found a house that was being built in the country, and she bought it before it was finished. And the house never got finished, not because she died young, she died old, but she was always throughout her life adding extra rooms to the house. And it's almost said that, or it is said that she was trying to turn the house into some sort of a maze that would confuse any spirits trying to come after it. It was constantly changing and shifting. She used numerology a lot in her house. So, for example, the windows would often have 13 panes of glass in them, and big enough rooms would have 13 windows in them, etc. She had rooms that were organized in the shape of a cross, etc. So she was trying to build something that she felt was protecting her from demons, etc., or ghosts. Anyway, that is the famous Winchester Mansion. Fast forward to today's times, and unsurprisingly, it's the source of many, many ghost stories. Lots and lots of people who've visited there or worked there complain or report about seeing lots of things that they just can't explain. And the most famous ghost in the Winchester Mansion is the Wheelbarrow Man. A man who is dressed in old clothes, who is pushing a wheelbarrow around, and then when people turn to speak to him, he's suddenly not there. He seems like he's getting on with his daily business, not malicious or anything like that. I think he's quite a popular figure, but when you see him, if you blink, he's gone. And that's my story.
Well, what a crazy story there, Cats. I mean, who would imagine that somebody could see a man in a wheelbarrow? Maybe today's story has something to do with that. Who knows? What do you think?
It would be a massive coincidence, wouldn't it, if yet again my story has something to do with the story we're about to hear. It's almost as if it's quite formulaic and we plan this stuff out.
Anyone would think you might be psychic, Cats.
You never know. You never know. Well, I'll let you introduce a story and we can find out.
Well, yes, today's guest is called Peter, and he has had this story for the longest time. I believe it's many decades old, and it's something that he's never forgotten and something he wants to talk about and share his experience with you today. So without further ado, we are going to introduce today's guest, and today's guest, again, number 2, is Peter. Are you there, Peter? Are you ready to take it away?
Hello, yes I am. Yep, ready to go.
Perfect. Right, I'm going to put myself on mute, and you can tell our audience exactly what happened. Away you go.
Okay, right, thank you. Well, my name is Peter, and this happened to me many, many years ago. I'm now 66, but I was born in 1955, and I was at a boys' boarding school. 1971-72 time, and I can't remember exactly what year it was. So I was about 16 years old. And in a boarding school, we used to have homework in the evenings, which was known as prep. And I was part of a little gang of boys, four or five of us all together, but on this particular occasion, of 4 of us. And we used to go out in the evening after we'd done our prep for a quiet cigarette, which was, of course, was totally illegal in the school, but a lot of people did. And I was one of those smokers then. And there was a particular place that we used to go to every now and again, and it was by the sports ground. And it's difficult to I'll try and describe it, but it's a long wall, probably about 10 foot high, brick wall, with a gap in it for the pavilion, so you could go into the pavilion from it. But a bit further along was another gap which went into a little storeroom, which is where they kept all the tractors and things like that from keeping the grounds, mowers and things like that. And that's where we used to go in there for a cigarette. It's very useful from a point of view of escape, because it meant that if we had someone on KV, as they called it, someone on watch out, and they would be standing just by the side of, inside the little area where the tractors were kept, but you could see both ways. This would have been, I don't know what time of year it was, I genuinely can't remember, but it was at a time when this would have been about 7:30, and it was still light, but it wasn't that light. It was dark enough to be able to maybe run away and not be spotted or made out who it was. Anyway, we were there having a cigarette, and then the chap who was on the watch out, he shouted, someone's coming. And then he then ran it back into it, and we put our cigarettes out. We waited, and we heard this noise, and it sounded like a sort of eek, 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 noise, and there were 4 of us. 3 of us could see exactly. We could look out behind the tractors. The other one was actually right in the corner at the back. He didn't see this, so he was there, but he didn't see it. So when we talked about it afterwards, he didn't see anything. But the 3 of us saw basically the same thing, which was a man pushing a wheelbarrow, and he went right past, probably no more than about, I'd say, 20 feet away. He walked past with this wheelbarrow and carried on. But it was interesting because we didn't recognize the person. And bearing in mind, this was quite a small school. We knew everyone who worked there, and we did not recognize, none of us recognized this person. And he was definitely wearing clothes which were not contemporary. I don't know what they were, but they were not contemporary. And this thing went past, and of course, my heart was going like crazy. I can't tell you. It was really, really frightening. And then eventually, probably, I would say eventually, time's difficult to gauge, but it was not more than maybe about 30 seconds. One of my friends, he looked out and he said, "It's okay, he's gone." And there was no sign. We went out, there was no sign of this thing. Now, bearing in mind that this wall went on for probably another, I don't know, difficult to say, but 100 yards at least. It's a long wall. So if it had been a person, a real person, pushing a wheelbarrow, they would have had to run like crazy, faster than what's his name, Usain Bolt or whatever, to get round the side of the wall, or he would have had to take himself and the wheelbarrow over a 10-foot wall and jump down to the other side. Now, that's what happened. We were all shocked by this, and after we then literally went right straight back to where we were supposed to be going back to the junior common room, or whatever it was that they called it. But when we spoke afterwards, we all remembered the same thing. But one of the chaps with me was so traumatized by this, he actually went and saw the vicar. The vicar who was the school vicar, but he was also a teacher. But he was the vicar, and he told him the story. And he had what, I guess at the time, in those days, I don't think it was known as counselling, but that's what he was doing with this young chap. And he was really, really traumatized by this. And we then were asked individually by this chap, the priest, the vicar, to go and tell him what we had seen. And that's what happened. Now, to this day, I don't know. I don't really believe in ghosts, honestly, because rationally, I think it doesn't make sense. But this is something that happened, and I, to this day, have no real explanation for it. Geographically, it doesn't make sense. Now, the other thing, of course, is if it had been someone playing a prank, and people did play pranks, why did we not get, like, in a month's time or a few days later, say, you thought it was a ghost or something? But that never happened, not to this day. And that's basically the story.
Wow, thank you so much. Well, Ranty, do you want to go first, or shall I? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I actually enjoyed that story, funnily enough. I thought it was going to be, honestly, I didn't think it was going to be quite as interesting as that, especially when you're talking about the distances involved and things like that. You see, I'm very aware of things like that myself too, and walking. When I was younger, I used to have OCD, which involved counting footsteps and things like this. And
right.
You can normally walk about 2 steps for every 1 second. So I was trying to figure it out, and you said 100 yards, and then I'm thinking 100 yards, 30 seconds. Okay, that's only 60 steps. So I was kind of like going back in my head and thinking, okay, well, yeah. That makes sense. That he couldn't have just disappeared. And it was a group thing too. And then you heard this rusty wheelbarrow, and it didn't have the contemporary clothing. That's all very interesting to me. I do have an idea. But I'm not going to talk about it just at this second. I want to see if Katz has got any questions for you.
Okay.
Yeah, I do. And I don't have an idea at this point, but please don't be offended by any of these questions. What we have on this podcast is...
No, not in the slightest.
We have what we call, I kind of named it housekeeping questions, where we know people who are listening are going to want to know. So, and some of the questions will be so mind-blowingly obvious. So I know you said that you all saw this individual and you were all very traumatized.
Not all of us. 3 of us did out of the 4.
3 out of the 4, sorry.
Yeah.
And that's what I was coming on to. Is it possible that, just one person perhaps saw this thing, and through the storytelling of, oh, did you see that? What was it? It's kind of morphed into everybody actually saw it.
Yeah. Again, we are talking about many, many years ago, and of course, you know, I know things do, you know, you forget and things like that. But it was such a vivid, and my recollection, and I can only say this, of the discussions we had afterwards, we all saw it. We all saw the same thing. That's my recollection. But you know, you could be right. I mean, maybe that's what happened.
Oh, I'm not. I'm definitely not claiming it did. I'm just getting these out of the way. It is a fascinating story, and I love the stories when more than one person has experienced something, because it makes it really, really hard to try and. It's like a puzzle to be solved, isn't it? So the person had, let's say, a different type of clothing on. Can I ask about the wheelbarrow? You know, was it an old wheelbarrow? Was it a modern, brand spanking new shiny one?
Again, it was semi, you know, dusk or whatever. So I couldn't see it. It didn't look like a modern wheelbarrow. It looked, again, it was a wheelbarrow. That's really all I can say. I knew it was a wheelbarrow because of the shape, if that makes sense. But I couldn't say, oh, it was a, you know, one with a metal wheel or anything like that. But it was making a noise, and it sounded like a, you know,
right, okay,
like that.
So you could hear it too. Okay,
yes.
That
oh yeah, we definitely heard it. Yeah.
So I have a question, which would be, where would they normally house the wheelbarrow if you were stood in this room where all the tractors were and things?
I have no idea. That's a very good question. They didn't have wheelbarrows in there. This room that I was in, or this little shed, was purely and simply for the motorized equipment. So it would have been like the mowers that they use, the rollers that they use for flattening out the cricket pitch, those sorts of things. Where they kept all their normal hand tools and things like that, I don't know. I can't remember, actually, to be honest.
And how close were you when you saw him?
We were in this little shed, as I said, a couple of tractors and stuff in there, and I was sort of peering out from behind the tractor. So I'd say it was probably around 20 feet, something like that. Difficult to gauge, but it wasn't that far. But, you know, near enough to make out it was a person, a man, as far as I'm aware, pushing a wheelbarrow.
Okay.
But he had I didn't mention it, but he had a hat on, but it looked a bit like a sort of hat that it wasn't a contemporary hat. You know what I mean?
How long do you think you observed this person pushing the wheelbarrow for before you stopped seeing him?
Oh, I mean, we were actually inside, so I probably. Oh, no, this is a difficult question. It's seen quite a while, but it probably wasn't that long. Probably 15 seconds, something like that. At a guess.
That is quite some time, though.
Because he was away. No, I mean, if I can give you an idea of how wide the entrance was, it was probably the equivalent of a double garage.
Right.
Yeah.
I've got one question. So 15 seconds is a reasonable amount of time.
And that's a guess. I am guessing. We're talking a long time ago. But I do remember it, it was quite a while that I saw this person going past. But the thing was that it wasn't the chap who was on, as they called it, KV, was the lookout. He was the first one to go and look out, and he looked left because it came from right to left. He looked left and couldn't see it. And when we discussed it afterwards, we just decided there's no way anyone could have pushed a wheelbarrow or either that far out of sight or thrown it over the wall. So
when you're watching this person with the wheelbarrow, he's in this place we got tractors, obviously obstacles in the way. How aware did he seem of his surroundings? Was he dodging the tractors that were there? Was he walking as if... I know it's probably a difficult question to answer, but did he seem aware of what was around him?
No, he was pushing this on open ground. I mean, there was nothing in the way of it. I mean, immediately outside the shed that we were in was just the playing fields. So there would be the bit. It was a sort of, I can't remember what it was laid out for, because this was a large field that was used for cricket, rugby, football, and I can't honestly remember what it was laid out for. But there was nothing would be in his way. And he certainly did, and this person certainly made no effort or to show his awareness of us being there, because he didn't look out. Well, not that I could remember anyway. Looking our way, he was just going about his business, pushing a wheelbarrow. That's all I remember.
Last question from me then. Last question, then I'll stop pestering you. In the direction he was walking with the wheelbarrow, if he'd have just kept going in that straight line in that direction, like where would he have got to?
Probably about a third or halfway along the wall, the side of the wall, or the length of the wall.
So he was basically walking to the wall. He would, like, there was no.
He was walking along there. He was walking parallel to the wall. So we were looking out and towards the field, and to our left and right was a wall. He'd come from the right, going left, and there's a long straight wall. It was a straight wall, about 10 foot high, brick wall.
What I mean is not how far did he get along though. What I mean is if he'd just carried on walking and carried on walking and carried, like, basically, what could his possible destination have been?
Okay, yeah. The only destination would have been at the end of the wall. The wall came to an end because that was the road that actually came into the school. And then he could have gone left, which would then be heading down towards the school, and we wouldn't have been able to see him because he would have been out of sight. But to be fair, it was dusk, so we might, you know, he might have disappeared out of sight when he got slightly before he got to the end of the wall. But I don't think so. I think we would have seen him. But my friend, who was on watch out, when he looked out, he couldn't see him, and that was the thing that shocked him and shocked all of us, really. Or where did he go? Who was it?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you've mentioned earlier that basically you'd never seen this guy before. You had no idea who he was. You knew everybody at the school. This was a stranger pushing a wheelbarrow in those lands, in clothing that wasn't contemporary to the era, and also, in your opinion, and clearly in the opinion of the other people that were there, because they had to go and get counselling, it would assume that
one of them did.
Yeah, you would assume that obviously he couldn't have made it to the end of the wall going at the pace he was. Well, I have a question. Obviously, it's going to be to do with the noise that it was making. You said that you heard it going coming towards you, but when it passed out of sight,
it stopped.
Aha, interesting.
Yes, it stopped.
That's something that you wouldn't have expected if they'd have picked up the pace to go faster. The noise would have
exactly. These were all, I remember, these were discussions we all had afterwards, trying to work out what it was.
Yeah, and obviously one person had counselling, as you say, and clearly yes. I would say that what you're doing now is therapy, because after all of these years, you know,
I think you're right.
You didn't speak to the pastor at the time, or, you know...
He interviewed us afterwards. He called us. But what was interesting was it was kept quiet. It never got out. No one else in the school knew that we're aware of. Now, to be fair, the priest, the vicar, he might well have told other members of staff or the headmaster or something. But he, it never came out. No one ever knew about this, and we kept it quiet because we were so, I think, frightened by it, really.
Yeah, and I think that's my point, is that, one of you needed immediate counselling.
Yes.
And it seems that after all these years, from 1971, 1972,
yeah.
That's a good 40 years ago.
I know. Don't remind me.
here you are now, telling us and telling the world about this story to kind of get it off your chest. So
yes, that's very true, actually.
So you might not be the only one. The other people that were there might have needed this too. So... Okay, so I'm getting an idea of some things that it may be.
Okay.
I'm just trying to think, is there any other questions that I need to ask you, basically? Talked about the noise as well. I think that noise is important, the fact that it just stopped. I do feel that's an important...
it is. And again, we remember having this conversation with my friends. My recollection of it is that it was very clear we could hear. That's what stopped us. Made us shut up and put our cigarettes out, is the fact that we heard the noise and the chap on KV saying someone's coming, and then the noise, and then literally I just remember it stopping, and that's when the other chap went out and had a look and no one was there.
Right. Well, I think we've asked you all the questions that we can think of asking you right now, so we will have to go away and have a little think about this, and just try and come up with something basically to figure out what's going on.
if you're able to solve this, that would be great, because I, to this day, and genuinely don't know what it was. I've tried. I am not. I genuinely do not actually believe in ghosts and things like that. I don't tend to, because I look at things in a rational way. I think that can't be true, surely. But this is something that happened to me, and I remember it, and I have no real explanation for it.
Right, well, we're going to retire to the pit, and we shall speak to you in a bit. Okay, take care for now.
And you.
Well, Peter, thank you so much for that. It was an absolutely excellent story, and I'm definitely scratching my head about it. And before we go any further, I have just exercised my Google Ninja skills, and it is the Winchester rifle. That's put my mind at rest, at least. I don't know about you, Ranty, but I feel like I've educated myself about something today. But we've got 2 stories to sum up. I don't know how we're going to do this, so Ranty, I'm going to defer to you for that, mate. What do you think?
Right, well, I can sum up both together, because I actually feel that there are 2 connected stories here. It might seem that they're not, but, you know, when you're talking about the paranormal, there is a lot of similarities and a lot of different stories that you can probably say this was this or this was something else. And I feel that these 2 are connected in some way. Can I prove that? Absolutely not. I can only go off the recollections of what these people have told me. We've had Peter and Matt both told us fantastic stories, and basically things that shouldn't have been where they were in that time, at that moment, that then just disappeared. That they heard and saw these things that should not have been there. Like I said, they shouldn't have been there, and then they just vanished. So to me, it seems like it was maybe some kind of glitch in the Matrix. And for those of you that don't know what that is, it's some kind of crossover between parallel worlds. I believe that maybe it was something along those lines. Of course, I could be completely wrong. Of course, you know, it might have nothing to do with it. But from my own perspective, I'm going to give an insight into this. This is what I would think. So I think that maybe this plane was out of its time, out of its jurisdiction. He heard it. He saw it. He was the only one it affected him. Nobody else saw this. And a lot of these glitch in the Matrix style events tend to just happen to some people or one person in a very localized area. And that's maybe why his father and his grandparents never actually saw the plane too. So that, for me, it seems reasonable. Same with the wheelbarrow. Same with the wheelbarrow guy. I believe that what they saw there was perhaps something in the past, a glitch in the Matrix from the past. And that's why they all saw the same thing. That's why this person pushing the wheelbarrow should not have been there in that location. It was obviously a private school, and everybody knew who roamed those grounds and who worked in the area. And this person was not of that time. He definitely shouldn't have been there. There was no need for him to be there. He disappeared. There's no way he could have just vanished in the time. As it's been made very clear that the wall was such a long wall that the person pushing the wheelbarrow couldn't have vanished in that time. So to me, just seems like it was some kind of glitch in the Matrix. I have nothing else further to say on that. What about you, Katz?
Well, they were both very, very good stories. The first one reminded me of something I went through when I was a child, actually. This is a true story. We were in the family car and we were driving to see other members of the family, and my dad was driving at the time, and he pointed out a light aircraft. I say light aircraft. It was one of those where you get like maybe 4 or 5 people in. I know about as much about planes as I do about rifles, to be honest, Ranty, but we saw this plane, and to me, this plane looked like it was coming towards the ground or the horizon really, really quick. And I was convinced this plane was crashing. I genuinely was convinced this plane was crashing, to the point where it was actually quite upset me. And I was very young, you know, I must have been 7 or 8 maybe, but I remember it really, really vividly. And I remember my mum, dad, and my brother not thinking anything of it at all, because I think they just perceived it to be a different distance away than perhaps I did. I think it's very difficult when you've got something that's an unknown size, an unknown distance away, to actually place exactly where it is. But I know at the time, I was convinced this thing was heading for the ground and was going to crash. Nobody else in the car felt the same, and there was no reports of a plane being crashed. It was just how I perceived it. And it's very easy for me to look back at that and to think about the story, Matt's story here, and think maybe something similar happened. I'm sure he saw a plane. I'm sure at the distance it happened to be, the size it was, it may have looked to him like it was on an inevitable collision course with a mountain. and I'm sure he genuinely 100% believed that. But I really wouldn't be surprised if it was just a perception issue. It would be good, I know I mentioned in the podcast, if he could recognize what the marking was on the plane and have a look to see whether there were any accidents in that area from that airliner. I don't know if he's done any Google reports about accidents or whatnot, but I kind of think that's what that is. In terms of Peter's story, well, what a story that is. I mean, he's such an articulate and skeptical gentleman. This is something that's obviously played on his mind for a long, long time, as it obviously did to his friend, who I think he said needed counselling for the incident. So it was obviously something that's really, really stuck with him over time. And I mean, all I can say is, in my opinion, is if they've all heard a wheelbarrow moving, then there has been somebody pushing a wheelbarrow. And maybe at the time the kids have been in a place where they, knew they shouldn't really have been. Adrenaline has been a little bit high or whatever. And the person's just pushed the wheelbarrow and gone somewhere else. I know that sounds absolutely ridiculous. Peter will be listening to that and be saying, well, where could he possibly have gone? There was nowhere for him to go. But I know we've talked about Donna Bridge and Elizabeth Loftus in previous podcasts about how when you recall memories over and over and over and over again, the significance of certain parts of those memories changes. We talked about the malleability of memory and remembering. And in that post sort of event where there may have been a little bit of confusion, has there been extra added significance added to the distances involved or the time periods involved? I don't know. I'm sure if Peter's listening, he's going to say, well, that's all tosh. I remember it really clearly. But that is all I can think of. The only other alternative will be a non-scientific alternative. So that's what I'm going to have to go with. But they were both great stories, and I really, really enjoyed them.
Yeah, and I think at the end of the day, we're only here to give our opinions on what we think may or may not have been the cause of these events and these stories. So I am the skeptic here, Katz is the scientist here, and it's probably highly likely that none of us are ever going to be right about this, on any story we ever talk about. So that's a disclaimer that we're saying here. But that still doesn't mean that we can't give our input into what we actually feel is actually happening here. And I think at least you do try to put the scientific reasoning pretty well there, Kat.
That's right. It gets really difficult sometimes. But no, I'll echo that. Nobody's here to debunk these stories in any way. But if a story may have a particular part of science that could possibly be attached to it, then it's nice to talk about that. But we weren't there for any of these stories. We weren't there at all. So certainly not claiming that I know the answers to anything at all. It is just a nice opportunity to geek out and talk a bit about science.
And paranormal as well, because a lot of paranormal things have happened to me. So I've got to hold my hand up there and say that when I hear these stories, I can absolutely relate to them. And I know that Katz has had very few instances of anything paranormal, whereas I, on the other hand, have had an incredible amount of paranormal things happen to me. So I'm very aware that there are a lot of unexplained things and things that I do feel that science could never answer, especially things that have happened to me. I don't think there's any explanation for the drums that I heard in my mum's bedroom or astral projection or anything like that. I don't feel personally that science can answer that, but that's just my own personal recollection of things. And I absolutely know, in my own heart anyway, at least, that these things, majority of at least, have a paranormal origin and cannot be answered by science. So that's my disclaimer.
And that's why this podcast is so much fun. I love it. I absolutely love it. I want to thank today's guests for coming on. I really, really enjoyed both the stories. I want to thank everybody for listening. Ranty, thanks for being the best co-host I have on this podcast.
I'll take that compliment. I'll take it.
And I guess we'll see you all another time.
Yeah, and I just want to echo what Katz has just said there and say that he is absolutely the best co-host I've ever had on this show as well. So thank you very much.
Goodbye, everybody.
See you later.